Hello and welcome to the Recursive podcast, the place where we interview one of the most interesting and influential people in the tech ecosystem in Southeast Europe. But today we're going to make an exception and we will bring a bit of an outsider perspective to what is happening in our region. Our next guest is one of the most influential people in tech in Europe and probably even worldwide. Mike Butcher is editor-at-large at TechCrunch, but his journalistic work has appeared in many media outlets like even The Guardian, BBC and Bloomberg. He was recognized by the Queen of England for his services in tech industry and journalism. Mike has also advised UK prime ministers and the mayor of London in terms of tech startup policy. Mike Butcher is also the founder of the non-profit Techfugees Foundation, a global organization providing tech solutions for displaced people. Mr. Mike Butcher, welcome to the Recursive podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's kind of like almost an honor to have you here. You know, I've been following you a bit from afar, and I had a very, very different idea of your personality. I always thought that you were kind of like, I don't know, very distant, very arrogant. Then I happened to run into you in Sofia, and I realized that you're a bit different.
What a lovely introduction, that I'm an arrogant person from the UK.
It's a story that the first impression always lies. Yeah.
I mean, I think probably it's quite useful to. I think probably that one of the things is that I do like to be clear with people, and I think in a professional setting, I like to engage at a fairly blunt manner, not tiptoe around the subjects too much.
Okay.
And of course, I'm just like anybody. I like to enjoy myself and have fun, and I tell jokes and what have you. So, but I think when you're dealing with subjects around the technology industry, around growth, around entrepreneurialism, let's just be real about it.
Straightforward, yeah.
Just be straightforward.
You have built a remarkable career in journalism. So before TechCrunch, you have been part of different outlets. You have founded your own outlet. What fascinated you about journalism? What fascinated you about storytelling? Why that?
Well, I think there was quite a funny moment when I was a teenager in school, and my father said, "What did the careers advisor tell you to do?" And I said, well, I went in and sat down and they said, you quite like people, don't you? And I said, yes. And they said, well, perhaps you'd be quite good at human resources, which I didn't really know what human resources were when I was 16. But later on at university, I realised I liked to talk to people a lot. And so journalism is quite a good thing for that. I sort of uncovered a corruption story at my university.
Really?
Yes.
That young?
And I thought, well, this is fun. It's cool. And so that's kind of when I got the bug for writing about, just writing really and getting involved in journalism.
What was actually fun? Part of being something which is, secret to others and then you unveil it, or was it about the impact that the story had?
I mean, a little bit of both. I mean, in the technology journalism world, sometimes there's opportunity for investigations, and most generally speaking, it's writing about the market and how startups are, emerging and things like that. I mean, I think the privileged position that journalists have is that we get to see trends. It's a little bit like being in the balloon above the battlefield, with seeing everybody in the trenches, and being able to see the trends and the movements in the whole industry. When you're an entrepreneur, you very much siloed in what you're doing,
and you have to be.
And for obvious reasons, you have to be. So it's a heck of a lot of fun being able to see what's going on, from high on up.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that because you mentioned the startup founders, I guess almost all of them want to be at some point in TechCrunch. They want to be featured there. So you've seen a lot of stories. You've been pitched from a lot of startups, especially in the beginning. I'm thinking, what are the major pitfalls that startup founders do when they pitch to journalists, and especially to you?
I mean, for obvious reasons, entrepreneurs are very obsessed with their own companies and their products. Yeah. And the mistake that they make, and it's not necessarily their fault, but it's more a misunderstanding, that someone is immediately interested in their product and obsessed with their product and their company as much as they are. And of course, the answer is no. And the big problem is that they don't describe the problem that they're trying to address. And I think that's when things that pique my interest most is when a startup presents the problem that they're addressing in an interesting way.
Can you give me an example?
It might, I mean, especially, we're living in very sort of strange and febrile times these days. And so, someone saying, for instance, I'm just going to make something up, like migration is a big issue in the 21st century. And so, if you start off with that, you're storytelling, effectively you're storytelling, you're saying, with the waves of migration that have been happening over the last 15, 20 years due to war or climate, there's a way to address these, and we can do it at a scalable way. And then I go, okay, well, that's a big issue. How are you going to do that? So that's a sort of an interesting way of doing it. Rather than immediately saying, we've got a EdTech product or something like that. It's like, okay, join the queue. Yeah. So I think addressing the problem is really important, and just storytelling. Think like a storyteller.
Yeah, I think this is the hardest part. I mean, from experience that's a craft, to think like a storyteller.
Yeah, but also I often say to entrepreneurs, know your own market. You do need to sort of watch the news and read the news fairly regularly, especially in your field, and just coming to the market cold isn't going to help you. So
putting everything into a context, basically.
Yeah,
okay.
And I think the other thing is I wrote a thing on my personal blog many years ago, MikeButcher.me, called "The Press Release is Dead," and it was basically about saying to entrepreneurs who can't afford professional communications advice at the early stage, how do you approach the media and how do you do it effectively? And I wrote a fairly kind of English rant, basically, about how to do that, and so I'm basically trying to help the entrepreneurs think a little bit more like journalists, thinking about communication rather than just sort of making it up as they go along.
What I find interesting is that all those famous founders like Elon Musk and even Steve Jobs, they were really, really loved by the media. They knew how to do their storytelling. It was one of their, I think, most important skills in a way. How do you achieve that when you're a techie who is, maybe a bit less versed in how to talk to people, how to present themselves, how to do marketing and sales? Because this is a skill that is, in a way, very empathetic, right?
I mean, I always say that 50% of being an entrepreneur is learning about communication, because you're trying to change the world. You're trying to introduce a whole new product or a whole new company into the world. In order to be able to do that, you must do an educational process to begin with. That's why I talk about the problem that you're trying to solve first before you launch into what the product is. So I think that, Elon Musk has had an advantage in the sense that, he's doing something quite sexy, doing rockets and space. But if you're not doing that, then you have to, storytell, as I said before. But the other thing is that one of the big sort of misunderstandings about entrepreneurship, especially in Europe, is that European entrepreneurs can't pitch. Well, the reason that they can't necessarily pitch as well as, say, US-style entrepreneurs is because they don't practice enough. A lot of the time, they don't practice. And there are some very, very simple things you can do to learn how to pitch, and you just practice. It's not hard. And a lot of people think that they've got their pitch down. And in fact, their counterpart over the Atlantic stood in front of a mirror and rehearsed their pitch 100 times or more. And so just getting the basics down of how to pitch, the problem you're solving, the product you've got, the solution you've got, the team you've got, the traction you've got, what you're going to do next, what you're asking for. Just hitting those basics and then practicing that narrative over and over and over again, getting a 30-second pitch, a 2-minute pitch, a 7-minute pitch all down is going to help you so much because then you'll be able to talk to a journalist straight away, or an investor, or someone at a conference, and then you can get your kind of message in quickly, and before people start talking to you about business or whatever.
I think it's going to bring also a lot of clarity in terms of brand and messaging. When you're forced, to practice that, then you come to the point where you are at the right amount of information. And
absolutely, and it helps so much just to practice.
So you have a good overview of the technologies which are out there and the problem solvers which are out there. Can you share what is the technology trend or invention at this point that you're most passionate about? Is there something that you're following fervently with the hope that it's going to change the world maybe for the better?
Well, I think fairly obviously, and I wrote about this on my personal blog over a year ago, which was that I wanted to switch to more and more covering climate technology. We have to halve emissions by 2050. We have to get emissions to the point where we are below 1.5 degrees warming across the planet. We have to halve emissions by 2030, and then we have to halve emissions again by 2040 in order to be able to hit those numbers. There are technologies that are deployable that can help, but we have to scale them very quickly, and we have to come up with them very quickly. So that's a big passion of mine. Yeah. I think that the world is much more displaced and much more, shall we say, much more, in a tricky place for obvious reasons now because of the war in Ukraine and the invasion by Russia. So cybersecurity is going to be important. And then for the first time in the last couple of years, we've seen the rise of new defense-oriented startups now. So directly helping the defense industry, specifically in democracies or in the West or democratic states around the globe. Because the biggest threats in the world are China, are Russia. And so defense startups are now an important thing. And I think it's something that we need to think deeply about if we like democracy, if we like freedoms, and those are important.
Actually, technological innovation and revolution is very, very connected to war situations. I mean, if we look back in time, it was the Second World War that gave a huge kick for technological revolution. Do you expect that this might happen again?
Well, we've just been through that, haven't we? Yeah. 2+ years of pandemic. We went from, I'm going to have to fly to New York for an hour meeting to switching on a Zoom or a Google Meet call and doing the board meeting over video. And when the Second World War broke out, we had piston-engined fighters, and at the end of it we had jet fighters 5 years later. Yeah. And that's exactly what's happened during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, I'd never heard of a supply chain logistics startup. True. 6 months later, couldn't move for supply chain logistics startup because the world lost its ability to be resilient during the pandemic. Supply chains were broken, key workers couldn't work, all those kinds of things. Enormous amounts of roboticization came in. And now, even though obviously the pandemic hasn't fully finished, it'll rumble on for a while, there are other big issues, especially because of the illegal invasion by Russia into Ukraine, that mean that there are a whole new set of problems. Cybersecurity is obviously one. Defense startups. Daniel Ek, or Eek, I should say, invested $50 million of his own money into a Swedish startup to help defense procurement and defense AI. So those are big issues. I mean, going forward, there are always the big trends. There's quantum, of course. There's, accelerating sort of chip development, edge computing, any number of trends always sort of, moving forward. The buzzwords like the metaverse and things like that, crypto and blockchain, of course, Web3 as it's been rebranded. All of these big trends, these are all trends that we cover at TechCrunch all the time.
Yeah, that's true. Because you mentioned a keyword, metaverse and Web3, and it's very much connected to the way that media will evolve, and probably also journalism will evolve, something that is going to affect us very, very personally. I wanted to ask you, do you see... So if we go back in time and we observe actually social media, it gave us a totally new way of distributing journalism. And still we struggle with the monetization problem. Do you think that now in the metaverse and in Web3 we're going to repair that? We're going to find new business models that are going to be sustainably financing journalism?
Well, 150 years ago, the front page of the Times newspaper had classified advertising on it. And that's classified advertising was really how a lot of media was funded for about 100 years. Social media, platforms like eBay removed those incomes from those media outlets. And so journalism has shrunk. There is less media outlets now. There is less journalists, even though perhaps there might be individual journalists, but you can't do, big, important journalism now unless you're at the biggest titles in the world, like the Financial Times or the New York Times. I actually worked on local newspapers in London and in the UK at one point, and we'd have, 12 or more journalists just covering a small area or maybe a small town. And many of those things just don't exist anymore. So journalism is very debilitated by the fact that advertising moved to platform-based platforms like, Facebook ads and eBay and other kinds of classified listings, and wasn't really replaced with any other kinds of business models. Although, of course, oddly enough, most people get their news now through social media, but those links that they're sharing have to be, links from newspapers, magazines, and broadcasters that have to be paid for somehow. So there has been a crisis in the media model ongoing. I think what you're hinting at is using cryptocurrency and Web3 to somehow prop up these business models. There's been talk in the last couple of years of things like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, as a way of funding media. I haven't seen any particularly amazing breakout hits on that score yet. Hopefully somebody will come up with an interesting model at some point around that. The cryptocurrency crash might not have helped because, Bitcoin has crashed in the last few months and hasn't particularly recovered. Now we're looking at a global recession on various markets that will affect cryptocurrency markets as well. So, the jury's still out on how those models will play out. I mean, the only thing that's sort of the bright sparks on the horizon have been individual journalists launching their own Substack newsletters, for instance, or doing their own kind of mini journalism.
Very curated kind of
journalism. Mini sort of journalism. But then often the journalism that they're commenting on has to be paid for as well. So there aren't necessarily any magic bullets as far as I can tell right now.
Yeah, in any case, we need some kind of disruption, because I still believe that journalism plays a very, very important role in, building a society and also educating future political tech leaders and whatever.
As Gandhi said, you can't have a community without a journal. So you have to have a journal for community and democracy to be vibrant and healthy.
I always thought that, journalism is in a way like school for grown-ups. Education.
It depends which journalism you read.
That's very much true. So lately you've been traveling a lot in Southeast Europe, and I was curious from your perspective of maybe someone who is at this point rather an outsider. Where is Southeast Europe on the map of on the startup map in Europe or maybe globally? What do you observe?
Well, I mean, for obvious reasons, you stick a pin in Prague and then sort of look right and then down a bit. But I think, I mean, I started at TechCrunch in September 2007, freelance for a year before that. So 15 years ago in this month, roughly. My view of the European tech scene, as it was a little bit like a sort of chicken scratching around in the dirt looking for worms, because there was hardly any startups then, even in London, Western Europe, or Paris or Berlin, and it took about a couple of years for these things to sort of emerge, really, but then. There was an explosion of technology, and we looked to Silicon Valley for some of the culture stuff. How do you do startups? How do you do entrepreneurship? How do you do high growth companies? How do you build teams? How do you build culture? And I think there was a massive flowering, a renaissance, really, in the technology industry. And similar things happened in Eastern, Central, Southeastern Europe as well. And what I think is interesting is how. You've had some big breakout hits like UiPath out of Romania, Infobip in Croatia, these quite big sort of SaaS-oriented companies, basically taking this astoundingly good raw talent that is so prevalent in Central and Eastern European countries as a legacy of the old sort of Soviet technical colleges. In France, produced 60,000 psychotherapy students last year, and they're all trying to get jobs as psychotherapists. I mean, whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, it was all about engineering. So this fantastic raw talent, and that's kind of what's happened. In this area, and so and now the VCs have turned up. So you've got the a plethora of VCs, the Vitoshas, the launch hubs, and the marathons, the venture friends, all over Southeastern Europe. And that's what's happening now. We have a media industry here as well with you guys. You guys have got a sort of a whole media empire growing here as well. And so those are the signals that I look for when a startup scene is taking off, and I think it is, definitely.
So there is like a parallel of what you have been observing 15 years ago when you started TechCrunch, and now what is happening here in Southeast Europe, and I would say the Recursive. And in this sense, I wonder, what was the contribution of TechCrunch for the evolution of these ecosystems in the West?
That's a very good question, actually. Yeah? Not many people ask that question. One of the things is that a long time ago, technology journalism was quite cynical. And so what would happen was an entrepreneur, a startup would say, I'm doing this company. And the journalist would go, they'd sort of, oh, well, it's not going to work. These guys are crazy. And I think also a lot of technology industry wasn't really about high growth startups and companies. It was and product. It was really a service industry. So it was all about like putting in servers and then charging the client or systems integration. It wasn't about startups. The difference that came along was when Web 2 came along, and using the internet as a platform and using cloud as a platform, suddenly you could build a product and you can start getting clients or start getting users rather for that product, and take off and become kind of rocket fuel, but you wouldn't necessarily know how to fund it. And as has famously been said before, often a startup isn't really it's a company in search of a business model. In some ways, the other famous phrase is being an entrepreneur is like throwing yourself off a cliff and assembling a plane on the way down. And so this whole new wave of entrepreneurship and sort of innovation came through, but you needed funding. So that's why venture became such a big part of the technology industry. And traditional technology journalism didn't cover that aspect that much. And so when the TechCrunch came along, we were sort of believers in the entrepreneur. We were advocates for the entrepreneur. So when a company would say, we're launching this, we go like, interesting, how's that going to work? Yeah. What's the business model? And they kick the tires on the whole thing. And rather than say, suck our teeth and go, I don't think it's going to work, we would go, this is launched, you guys check it out, we'll cover this company and see how they go. And that was the flip, really, in attitude in journalism around. And then lots of other tech titles sort of kind of followed TechCrunch, really, after that, with the way that we covered startups. So rather than being super cynical about it, go like, right, here's a new thing, let's see what it's like. Fine. Months and years down the track, you can check out, you can sort of cover it in a more objective manner. But when people are launching something new, we would give them their head. And that's kind of what people came to TechCrunch for. New startups, new fundings, new entrepreneurs.
It's pretty similar to what happened here when we started with the Recursive. I used to live abroad. And, negativism trend in journalism is something that is winning you users and readers. So you pretty much look for the drama. And I moved back to Sofia and we started writing about positive stories, success stories. And that brought organic traction. And I was like, well, there is something wrong here. So I think in this part of the region, the crisis has been staying for so long and we have been having so much scandals and corruption and actually really, really bad news that people are kind of hungry for the positive news again. And they were like, oh, but you write about young people who actually have the drive and they want to change the world for the better. And that was actually what was winning us, the readers and the recognition everywhere. Desperation.
Well, I think what you've tapped into and what you're sort of alluding to there is this hump generation called the millennial generation, who were really enormous compared to the previous generations, and now following them sort of the Gen Z generation. And so this generation came along, it sort of came of age during the financial crisis of 15, 20 years ago. It had to look for something, growth somehow. Yeah. Technology came along, and technology entrepreneurship and startups came along just at the right time for that generation. And now what you're seeing is the Gen Z generation coming along and going, right, let's get involved in this. Let's do this our way as well. So they're reinterpreting it all as well, all over again. And so it's absolutely a fascinating time.
It's an interesting observation. When you started back then, 15 years ago, how did you find the startups? What did you do? Because there weren't many. Did people know the word startup at all?
Well, I think it was rather fun when, for many years, lots of news outlets would say start-up rather than start-up as a one word. And I think that was a kind of always an interesting signal. I mean, the great advantage that we had when TechCrunch started, and it launched in July 2005, and then I was freelancing and then joined in 2007, was that it was out of San Francisco. And so people looked to the hottest technology trends. Certainly during that time and for a good long time afterwards, if you went to San Francisco, and sure, you could do meetings with people in tech, and then you go and have brunch on a Sunday or something, and you stand in a queue for brunch, and then realise that the person in front of you was talking about startups, and the person behind you was talking about Google Cloud stuff or whatever it was. Yeah. So it was just such a hothouse of meeting of minds. It was very much the mecca of the technology industry. But that sort of religion, shall we call it, spread globally and internationally. And so if I would sort of go to Shoreditch in the East End of London, which had traditionally been a cheap place to live, cheap offices, cheap rents, lots of engineers would live there, and suddenly that kind of blew up as in that part of London. You would go to kind of Mitte or Prenzlauer Berg or Kreuzberg in Berlin and walk into a coffee shop and flip open your laptop and there'd be Wi-Fi, and then boom, some startups would appear. I always joke that the correlation between Wi-Fi and coffee shops, was always, that's where you find the startups. But,
True.
But yeah, I mean, it took a while, but I think the other thing is that Europe got its act together on venture funding. You know, the earliest players like Index Ventures and Balderton and Alvin in Paris and, you know, Early Bird in Berlin and some of the earliest VCs really managed to power these technology entrepreneurs through. And there were so many more VCs now compared to their, you know, back in the day. And every ecosystem has its own, you know, set of VCs. And I think in Web3 has meant that it's hugely democratized. You launch a token or a blockchain, you launch it globally immediately. It doesn't really matter where you're from or where you live. So that's added to the whole piece as well. But yeah, I mean, the challenge these days isn't like, you know, where to find startups. It's like which ones to write about, because there are just so many.
How do you make the selection, by the way? I mean, you're getting bombed probably with lots of press releases, lots of people who write to you on all the channels that you are probably present.
Yes, I know. It's quite interesting when someone sends you an entire press release over direct message on Instagram. When I say interesting, what I mean is kind of annoying, because nothing much I can do with that. And I always just say I send them my email address instead. But yeah, I mean, there's big trends that you're always looking at in the markets, and you know, for starters. And I always say to entrepreneurs, you know, if you're doing something that's blowing up in the news right now, that's a good time to talk about what you're doing. Don't wait for, you know, 3 months until you think you're kind of ready. You know, jump on the opportunity. And that's always, you know, useful for those guys. But yeah, you know, these days it's also just a matter of like curation virtually, like to work out what you're actually going to cover. I mean, but the signals are fairly obvious, you know. Interesting technologies, interesting investors, you know, whether they're sort of on trend or not, you know, metaverse or whatever it is, climate, cyber, these are always, you know, interesting signals.
I have been thinking about your start as a investigative journalist. Do you miss that? Because, you know, writing with optimism about the new ventures is not really, you know, discovering something that is messy or... Well,
I mean, you know, you can switch into various different modes as a journalist. I wrote an article recently about a sort of gig economy startup that offering massages. And there's a lot of controversy around this subject, and we had to kind of tiptoe through the legal aspect of this. So yeah, it's not hard to, I mean, for me, I've sort of written about lots of kinds of stories over the years, so it's not hard for me to flip into investigative mode if I need to do that. Just switch it on. Because I have a reasonable amount of experience at this point. But I mean, I think that you know, those stories, or the bad news or the tough news, you know, always appears as well alongside all the good news and all the interesting new trends, etc. So it's just a sort of a matter of keeping your eye on the ball and seeing, you know, keeping your eye on the market.
When you were speaking about the, you know, the mecca for startups like Silicon Valley and in San Francisco, I've been thinking, at some point you started advising also government officials in their startup policy, or how to, you know, push innovation mostly in Europe, or I think in the UK. A lot of them try somehow to copy the model of Silicon Valley, and this is not probably possible. I'm thinking of how can we leverage the culture that we have in Europe and also in the different hubs in Europe and still develop competitive startup hubs as the one in Silicon Valley, as the one in Tel Aviv. Actually, if you look at each of these hubs, they have their own culture and they have their own specifics. They leverage the resources for innovation in a totally different way. They are the same, but they leverage them in a different way. What is your take on what, you know, should Europe or UK or, you know, Berlin focus on when they have to, you know, build their own ecosystems?
Many years ago, I was approached by the European Commission, and I became a special rapporteur on the startup ecosystem and wrote a document for the EU about how it should approach the startup ecosystem. I didn't, shout that from the hills, but that became part of the basis of how it approached the ecosystem. Somewhere in the EU Commission, in the library, there's my report from many years ago. And I think what the EU and the European countries didn't really quite understand was how the life cycle of technology entrepreneurship, about you creating products, scaling for growth, getting as big as you can, exiting or IPOing, and then people kind of doing it all over again. They didn't really quite understand, because most businesses for a long, long time were really just built to be as big as possible, and then you'd stop and just carry on with the business. You didn't take it to IPO, or you didn't sell it to another company. And that's what the new methodology, which we sort of borrowed from Silicon Valley, that was kind of brought into Europe a lot more, especially in tech. But but you're right that there's a way of you doing it in Europe. And Europe also, rather than often, you'll find the new product in America is, or North America is, we've made a new thing. Let's see if it works. A bit like Uber. Suddenly, all of a sudden, you could get a car to turn up where you were. Nobody thought whether it was legal or not. It just happened. Subsequently, we found out they knew that it was illegal. Everyone told them it was illegal, but they did it anyway. In Europe, often what happens is, can this be regulated? Is this against the regulations?
Okay.
And that can be a brake on entrepreneurship and innovation in Europe, but it also can be an opportunity. So I'm not against regulation. I'm not against those things at all. And also, I'm very much in favour of the European model of getting that regulation right so that innovation can flourish in the right way, and in a way that also doesn't damage society and doesn't damage economies, and so, but yeah, I mean that's why Europe is a different kind of a place to the US or to other markets. But it doesn't mean to say you can't be innovative. And we've seen how entrepreneurs in Europe have come up with so many different amazing businesses, despite the fact that some people think it's over-regulated or not.
And also a very segmented market. I mean, this is something also that we don't have still in parts of Europe, sophisticated, but you have to, think of many, many languages, many different cultures from day one if you want to do business in Europe.
Yes, but then that's not been really a break. There are many companies in Europe have scaled internationally and actually used the advantage of, say, coming from a smaller country like Romania or Bulgaria to test their model and then launch internationally or launch in the US into a larger market with a fully grown, fully tested product, which nobody even knew existed in some of these other markets. So there are ways of leveraging those advantages as well.
What is your take on pushing, or giving public money in order to fuel innovation? Actually, lots of the funds in Europe are, in a way, funded by public money, by our taxes. Do you think this is good for the economy?
I think that the best use of public funds in the innovation economy is really more the fundamentals of research and development, universities and things like that. When governments try and pick winners in a very, very fast-moving market like technology, they often get it wrong. The mechanisms that have worked and been shown to work is governments back or supranational organisations like the European Investment Fund, for instance, becoming funds of funds, investing as LPs in VCs that understand these very niche, fast-moving technology markets, rather than investing directly. Famously in the UK, an example of this is the UK post-Brexit buying a satellite company, which it was sort of told it was be a sort of competitor to GPS or something, and nothing of the sort. And yet we're now invested in this company, whether we like it or not. And that wasn't particularly a smart government decision. And so public money is much, much better spent on the fundamentals, the education system, the broadband networks. Part of the reason that technology companies flourished in Romania many years ago was that, for whatever reason, the government invested in fibre and very, very sort of high broadband.
Because we didn't have the copper.
Exactly. So it turned out to be an incredibly good idea. So you get it's a little bit like the old argument about, get the roads working and tarmacked, get the trains running on time, and then let people get on with the job. And that's the best way of doing it. Investing in education is incredibly important, and governments that think that they can, they want to kind of get involved in the technology markets are a little bit silly. They should really just be talking about, like, what about kids learning? Are our kids getting the right? Are we teaching our kids how to use Microsoft Word, or are we teaching them how to code? I'll tell you which one is more useful right now. And so
I was being taught Microsoft Office, yeah.
Yes, of course. Well, you were, but then I'm sure you got into other things, and it wasn't that useful, was it?
No.
So, yeah, getting it, teaching to code and things like that has been important, as well as obviously liberal arts, design, games, things like that. And those are the things that governments are probably best off looking at, rather than trying to pick winners in a very, very complex tech market.
Very much true. Although I have to say that, the public money that has been spent on directly in startups here in Southeast Europe, especially in Bulgaria, they show effect, the whole spillover effect, and, igniting the spark for entrepreneurship and doing startups is pretty much from that time. Otherwise, probably we wouldn't have ecosystems at all. I'm not sure.
I mean, yes, not everything can be left to the markets. I totally agree. The US has always had a very large advantage in the sense that it's a very large single market of over 300 million people. But don't forget that large swathes of innovation in the US has come from public money being invested in fundamental research, fundamental R&D, NASA, you name it. And so, there's always a role for public institutions to be involved. But picking, as I said, picking winners or being right down, trying to sort of pick early stage startups is really not the best place for government to be.
And would you have like a special take on how we can up, the level of the ecosystems in Southeast Europe? What would be, the most critical resources that we need to find in order to become competitive as the West, or is it just a question of time?
There are things that governments can do. I mean, we saw a fintech boom in the UK as a result of government's sort of deregulation of banking systems. So going to banks and saying, listen, this isn't really your money. You're holding the accounts, the deposits of your customers. Really what you need to do is to be open to other companies being able to, plug into your systems via APIs and letting other kinds of financial products or financial technologies flourish. And that's what the open banking laws and legislation in the UK did. Now, there are thousands of fintech startups, and that's created enormous value. Neo-banking has happened as a result of that. That happened also as a result of EU legislation, similarly saying that banks should open up their systems. So you can see that where there are public assets in infrastructure, for instance, that can be leveraged for public good, in allowing private companies to create innovation. In the UK, there's startups that use the bus maps and the times when buses turn up to allow you to work out when the bus is going to come. And that wouldn't have happened if the whole thing had been carried on being locked down. So there are the ways that governments can get involved in. I mean, I think in this part of the world, there's nothing wrong with broad collaboration at government level about business, about encouraging investment. In the UK, we have something called the SEIS, or Special Economic Investment Schemes, which allow high net worth individuals to invest in small, high growth startups and get a small tax rebate as a result. It de-risks the investment, and it also means that one of the problems, especially in Europe, is that people are obsessed with property, hotels, restaurants, office blocks.
Yes.
And there's enormous amounts of wealth locked up. And this means that you end up with a rentier economy. People just making money every year, turning over, getting money for rent. That doesn't put money into the innovation economy, and it doesn't create jobs, because there are new companies. You can't have new companies out of one office block, right? So what you do is, if you can allow some of those property owners, particularly, to say, let's diversify our portfolio, let's put some money into high growth startups which create jobs, and then allow the government to de-risk that investment through tax incentive, then you get a real kind of flowering. In the UK, it's not unusual to be an angel investor now because of these incentive schemes. Okay. And I think that's what lots of European, and especially Southern European and Eastern European countries could do, is to incentivize high net worth individuals who have these large asset portfolios to put some of it into the economy, which creates new things, rather than sitting on a hotel and or an apartment block and collecting rent.
Very much true. I think actually, property and real estate in Bulgaria, for instance, is one of the highest in the world. They are pro person. It's per capita. It's amazing. We really want to own things. I guess that's probably also kind of like a legacy mindset.
It's very similar to the UK.
Yeah.
But then also the UK has had many right-wing governments who, and left-wing, by the way, governments who very sort of market-driven and have created these investment schemes which has created thousands of angels, basically. And that's really helped the technology industry.
I'm going to bring you back now to journalism, because I have also another question. So you have interviewed very, very interesting people. I saw in your history Tony Blair, but also Dmitry Medvedev. I'm sorry, I still have trouble pronouncing his name. Kevin Spacey.
I know.
And lots of really, really interesting tech founders. From all these people, without maybe, endorsing anyone, what was the most interesting interview that you did? Who with?
I think that, I interviewed Kevin Spacey, who's now rather derided figure, alas, only really because he was trying to sort of promote a technology company that he had been given some shares in. I've interviewed Tony Blair about his ideas about how big tech could be either reined in or big tech, like the big Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks. What do we do about the control that these big technology companies have in society? I interviewed the supermodel Lily Cole as well about her efforts to create a sort of a sharing economy as well. I think probably one of the more interesting ones I did was with the founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, who famously was also the founder of VK, or VKontakte, in Russia, and then went on to create Telegram. And around about the time that I was interviewing him, the very, very ultra extremist group called ISIS had invaded Iraq and was effectively trying to turn Iraq into a Muslim caliphate. And they were using Telegram specifically to coordinate their efforts and their troops and their war efforts. And I did ask him, what he thought about that. And he sort of had to fall silent for about a minute before he could answer me. And I think that's just indicative of sometimes how entrepreneurs sometimes release technologies into the into the world and don't necessarily know the wider implications of how they're going to be used, and sometimes don't care, unfortunately.
I think this is worse. I mean, not knowing who is going to use for what purposes is, in a way, I don't know, you can't predict it. Not always.
Yeah.
But not caring about that. This is what bugs me quite often.
It might be the case that the entrepreneur does care, but can't publicly say that they care.
Sure.
Because as soon as they do, it means they're liable for all sorts of strange things that happen on their platform. Famously, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't take the rap, or as it were, for many of the strange things that have happened on Facebook. Because as soon as he did, then he'd have a lot of lawsuits on his hands. But I think that, technology entrepreneurs and the people that I've interviewed do need to, answer for some of the things that they do that might have, difficult or problematic effects on the planet and on the world. And that's why I'm kind of excited about this new era of climate tech, about how entrepreneurs are changing the culture in startups to address some of the biggest major issues that we face as a planet and as a population, as a species, effectively.
What kind of, or do you have like a person that you would like to talk to when it comes to climate change and climate tech?
I mean, I think that I'm concerned about the kinds of messaging that people like Elon Musk have around the climate. There is a movement at the moment in some circles in Silicon Valley and in technology to talk about how we need to go to Mars, and we have to perhaps think about the many billions of people that might appear in 20 years time or 30, 50 years time or 100 years time, and preserve human life for that. Well, I mean, there are only so many bunkers you can build, and I'd much rather us thinking about the here and now, about the fact that 1 billion people in Africa may have to move in the next 20 or 30 years because of climate change, because of global warming. And I'd rather us think about that now, because as soon as we think about it now, the faster we can solve these problems. Many people have been talking about the energy crisis over the last few months, obviously exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. If we, for instance, switch to renewables and wind turbines 30 years ago, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. If onshore wind and offshore wind had been put in place, in the 1990s, when we had the technology, we wouldn't even been talking about the price of gas right now. So let's get on that train and not keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, which is obviously the definition of madness, expecting a different result. So, and I think that's where we could move forward very quickly, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't.
Yeah, the war in Ukraine is actually a very, very important time in history right now. On one side, it kind of brings us back to thinking of the East and the West, and how we're all kind of like in the middle of superpowers, which is, in my opinion, very, very old-fashioned. But still, it's also, bringing our attention to the sectors where we need to innovate, like energy. A couple of years ago, no one would talk about nuclear power. Now it's back on the table. It's very, very interesting. Should I ask you about your take on nuclear power? Should we use that?
I think that we've seen over the last 20 years or something, the environmental movement get it wrong about nuclear power.
Bill Gates started investing a lot at some point exactly in this field, and thinking of innovation and how we can actually make it safe, right?
We definitely got it wrong about nuclear power, and in fact there are now startups in the nuclear area coming up with new technologies to make nuclear power stations more efficient or smaller or faster to build. And I always get it confused between fission and fusion. I think it's fusion that we need to be concentrating on now. That would be a fantastic thing. And I think also the other thing is that we could do a lot of things around existing infrastructure that would make a difference. Why are we driving around in these heavy cars, for instance? If we had small, I mean, why is the e-scooter revolution has taken off? Because you just need a scooter to take one human being around somewhere. And I think that's been a fascinating movement. So I think there are ways that we can solve these energy crisis, and we can move forward. And I think that it will happen, but we have to make it happen as fast as possible, and that's why I think it's so important, especially the technology industry should power ahead in those areas.
When it comes to climate change, I must say that I'm a bit skeptic if we're going to be fast enough. So, in a way, I think especially Europe should prepare for the next climate refugees. I'd like to bring you to another project that you founded, the Techfugees Foundation. It's a non-profit thing. But you started that totally out of conviction that it's actually important, to find solutions for displaced people. We saw that I was in the WhatsApp groups, and I was following what is happening there, and we saw a lot of movement, especially at the beginning of the war. Do you think that Techfugees would manage to provide solutions also at a later point? Is it something that you would like to stay and to, help us realize that we're going to have refugees, we're going to have migrant waves, we just need to learn how to deal with them? Yeah.
Well, I founded an organization called Techfugees, kind of like tech plus refugees in the one word, Techfugees, in 2015 as a result of the Syrian refugee crisis. And I just couldn't stand the fact that in the 21st century, children were dying on beaches, trying to get to safety, crossing the Channel from France to England, or crossing the Mediterranean from Turkey to Greece or something like that. I just thought it was just unconscionable that this should be happening in the modern era. And so I thought that the way that governments and people and societies deal with this needs to change quickly. We're walking around with a smartphone that's more powerful than the computers that sent people to the moon. True. And yet we can't deal with human migration. We've got to be able to deal with it. It's an inevitability. It was happening because of war and strife a few years ago, and now it's going to be happening increasingly, not just because of war, but because of climate change. So why can't we do this? So I founded Techfugees, and really I think it was a way of getting the technology industry involved in the issues surrounding refugees and displaced people. And now we have chapters all over the world and several programs running. And we very much built it as a sort of decentralized organization. If you're in Berlin and you're in the technology industry, you can join Techfugees and you can get involved. Similarly, we even had chapters appear in Australia where they had refugees from Asia. So, I think, the old methods of dealing with refugees, of putting up tents and giving people food and stuff. Now, the modern refugee is not dissimilar to a digital nomad. They want to know where the power is and where the Wi-Fi is.
That's an interesting perspective.
There's no, as I always say, there's almost no difference between a digital nomad and a refugee. They both want power. They both want the Wi-Fi. And yes, they might need some shelter somewhere. But those are often the things that they need first. So, and I think we need to kind of get out of this old habit that often societies have of thinking, oh, these refugees, they're going to be a burden on society. It's a load of crap. These people are very often educated, they're enthusiastic, they're hungry to learn, they're hungry to contribute to host countries. And often, as we've seen with Ukraine, if things change in their home countries, they'd actually fine with going back because they want to rebuild their country or whatever it is. True. And so we should be welcoming refugees, and we should be helping them, supporting them. And through technology, we can do that in a scalable manner, whether it be through education. I mean, now, because of the pandemic, we've done multiple studies now show that you can do therapy over video easily, and so there's nothing to say we can't do mass scale education. We can do all sorts of things now, partly because we learned during the pandemic that we can do them remotely. So we can do that with refugees and displaced people, either in host countries or some other way. And we can get economies moving and not leaving this human talent and human resource on the table just to fester and to not be able to contribute.
I find it fascinating that someone would actually refer to you as a tech journalist, but you care mostly about society and also environment. Now we hear the quality of life, in a way, how we live, and equality and freedom for other people. In this sense, I have a question. If you have to think yourself into an older age, and if you look back, what do you want to see there? Like, what is the impact that you would like to have?
One of the things I've tried to do is use the voice that I've been given as a technology journalist in the ecosystem, and I guess have been covering it for a while, is as well as do my day job as a journalist, is also to use the voice I've got to make improvement or suggest improvements in the world. I'm a big fan of sort of creating longevity in institutions. So I founded Techfugees. I also founded an organisation called Tech Vets, which helps military veterans in the UK convert into technology and cybersecurity. And I probably have a few other ideas up my sleeve in the future.
I'm sure that you have.
But that's, it seems like a waste just to, use it just for writing articles. I might as well use that voice for other things as well, and there's no reason why I can't. And also along the way, I get to meet all sorts of interesting people like yourself. And it's a privilege. And hopefully I'll be able to do it for a bit longer.
I really hope so, because I would like to exchange with you on several topics and maybe also ideas that we can do together. It's been super interesting to talk to you. There are many other topics that we can actually discuss, and we had the occasion also to do that in the past days. I never, really thought that you would have such a broad spectrum of interests and knowledge that you can share. And I never really also thought that you take this responsibility for the influence that you have on people so importantly, to, contribute for a better world. I find it fascinating. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure what to say to that, but I appreciate the sentiment. Thank you for inviting me.
It's sometimes I'm also blunt with my compliments, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
In this episode of the Recursive podcast, Dan Mihaescu, an investor and founding partner at Gapminder.
Okay. It's a difference between willing to try and being driven, being real driven to do things, really wanting to make a unicorn.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I mean, some of the companies that you mentioned there, we are having these conversations in the board among, with the entrepreneurs, the founders, and among ourselves. How can you get it to that level when it is, $1 billion when will be, maybe, it's a discussion, not if, but when we could do around that 1 billion valuation.
Yeah.
It's a discussion about when and how. And this is a question, it's also a question I learned from somebody else, honestly, but I really loved the question I put in many cases to the founders. So how big can this be? How can you drive this, do this to grow this to 100 million euro revenues yearly? Right? Because if it is 100 million, it's obviously above 1 billion in valuation. It's a simple question. And you see how they think, and if they ever thought about it. And you see who in the team is answering this. So it's very interesting.
And if you're just as passionate about innovation as we are, hit subscribe for the Recursive podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. We're everywhere.